Hello and good afternoon to the very first people, the punctual people that have signed in already to come and talk about misinformation with us. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So first of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining this Isentia conversation. My name is Ali and I work at Isentia and I'm going to be facilitating this webinar today. I'm really looking forward to it. We are really keen to hear any of your questions today, but we have muted your microphones. So the best way to ask those questions or leave any comments for this panel of experts is using the GoToWebinar navigation panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So you should see a little speech bubble. That's where you can add a comment or a question in the chat. And there's also a question mark, which funnily enough, that does stand for questions. And I've got some very chatty, very exciting panelists today, but I'm still going to do my best to leave at least 10 minutes at the end of this 45-minute webinar today for your questions. Anything that is bothering you or you'd like to understand more in this space of misinformation, disinformation, and reputation. So look out for the question mark and the speech bubble for those questions. Now, I'm already talking a little bit about our panelists today, so I think it is probably time to introduce them to you. So with me, I have a panel of experts who are at the absolute coalface of detecting misinformation, understanding more about where that's coming from, and like our focus is today, stopping the spread. So let me introduce you to them. We have the cultural historian Kate Hanna with us today, and since April 2020, which is a pretty interesting time to start a job, Kate has led the Disinformation project, Aotearoa. So she's focused on understanding the nature and the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation in New Zealand. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Kate. We also have Sushi with us today, and Sushi works at RMIT FactCheck and RMIT FactLab. And Sushi brings with her more than 25 years experience as a journalist. Before she was at RMIT, she was working at The Age. And currently Sushi is doing a lot of really interesting work in the misinformation and the fact-checking space, training up journalists, working with Meta. So we're going to get stuck into that a little bit more later today. So thank you for being here, Sushi.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. On the panel today, the only bloke that we have is Franceso D'Orazio. So Fran is a researcher, a product designer, and an entrepreneur. And his area of speciality is online audiences and internet culture. And Fran is also the CEO and the founder of our sister company, Pulsar, which is a audience intelligence and social listening platform. So thank you, Fran. Thank you for joining us. You're on mute, Fran, so you might want to unmute that. Thank you. Fantastic. And I don't know if you'd believe this, but those bios that I just ran through, they were actually shortened versions. So everybody here has done some real deep thinking or action in this space. But I thought I'd shorten the bios and actually get stuck into the conversation today because I really want to get started. So well, I thought we'd go first, and Kate, I'll ask you for your thoughts on this, and then I'll hand to you, Sushi. Why is it actually so important to stop misinformation? If you were joining this panel today and you thought, you know, maybe misinformation is just like the way that social media has replaced gossip or word of mouth, how would you explain how important that is?
Such a good question, Ellie. I think, you know, a lot of us, particularly if we're in the generation that might be identified as Gen X or Xennials, as perhaps I might be, kind of grew up conspiracy theories in those early days of the internet, and they do have, you know, these compelling kind of features, their stories that are fun to share, you know, and they often can seem harmless. Like there's a really famous one about Aotearoa, New Zealand, that birds are fake, and that also gardening is banned. Like gardening is illegal in New Zealand. You're not allowed to plant a vegetable garden. So those sorts of ones can seem really innocent. But what we've seen, and I'm sure Sushi's got much more experience in this than I and Fran as well, but what we've seen over the intensive research we've done over the last 2 years is that increasingly mis and disinformation are leading people into splintered realities. So we're starting to see a lack of a shared sense of reality. And obviously, you know, there are tragic and really unfortunate consequences of that. So one of the ones that's taken place in the last week is obviously the mass shooting in Buffalo in the USA, which has been connected to the mass shooting that took place in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2019 through the dissemination of a manifesto and a live stream, and also is already being called a so-called false flag across the internet, which, you know, denies the pain that people are experiencing and makes it a problem that seems insurmountable if some people simply believe that it did not exist or take place.
What are your thoughts on that, Sushi? Why is it so important that we do focus on stopping or preventing or downgrading misinformation?
Well, when there's an overabundance of misinformation all mixed up with accurate information, it makes it really hard for people to know what to trust, who to trust, and how to find trustworthy, reliable sources. And this really rapid spread of baseless claims or incorrect and misleading information, it can cause real-world harm to people's health, to their financial position, and also to democracy. It basically contributes to a sort of a general distrust towards authority, and it can undermine the legitimacy of experts like scientists or candidates in an election. I mean, ultimately, it can simply undermine the integrity of elections, and that's how we choose how we want to be governed and by whom. So it goes to the very heart of how our society runs.
Was there anything you wanted to add there, Fran, before we moved on? Why is it so important to you and your role to think about stopping misinformation or minimizing it?
Yeah, for me, it's not necessarily about focusing on stopping or minimizing misinformation. It's more about providing enough context for people to understand what they're looking at. And for me, the job here is to make sure that we preserve the mechanics by which public opinion is formed, and making sure that public opinion is built on foundations that we can all understand and we can all rely on. Because we know that public opinion is the foundation of democracy, so without public opinion, there's no democracy. And therefore, if you don't make sure that the foundations of public opinion are kind of like solid, then you have a much bigger problem in the kind of like in the whole Western world than anywhere else that democracy is starting to take root. So it's a pretty crucial job.
It sounds like a crucial job. I'm hearing a lot of things about democracy, and we are going to get to the election shortly, but I wanted to spend a second talking about how you see the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Kate, you work and lead the Disinformation project. How do you see the difference between the two?
Look, we work, and I'm sure it's similar to Sushi and Fran. I mean, where we work, there is little difference. Misinformation, you know, usually is defined as information that is inaccurate and is shared without malicious intent, whereas disinformation has been intentionally created for malicious intent. How that works is that actually the impact of the information operates according to the intent of the sender or the sharer of that information. So the same piece of false information can act as misinformation when a well-intended person who comes across it on Facebook then reshares it about, say, COVID or elections because they're concerned, because they want their friends to know, because they think it's true. And that's very different from a high-profile disinformation producer and narrator like the ones that we're studying here in Aotearoa, using a really large platform to intentionally share a piece of disinformation that they know full well is false. So we think about impact and intent.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think bringing that into it is just a helpful clarification for anybody who hasn't thought so much about that distinction before. Sushi, I wanted to talk a little bit with you today about the ways that you're using technology to actually downgrade misinformation. So get into some of the practical ways that people are already working to minimize that spread of misinformation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that Debunks project and how you're working with Meta? How does that work?
So we've just entered into an arrangement with Meta. So basically what we do is Meta uses its algorithms and also user feedback to surface mis and disinformation on their platforms. So we're talking specifically about Facebook and Instagram. They then put those offending posts, if you like, potential misinformation, into a sort of bucket, if you like. And at RMIT FactLab, we can reach into that bucket and pull out whatever misinformation Meta has identified. And we then choose what we are going to fact check. Once we've fact-checked it and written the article, we then publish that article on our RMIT FactLab site. And we then provide the URL to for that article to Meta. Meta then attaches that URL to the offending post. So what the user sees is a warning on the post saying this post has been fact-checked as false by fact checkers. Do you want to read the fact check? And if you say yes, you click on it, and then that will take you directly to the corresponding link on our website. What Meta also does is it then uses its algorithms to push all those misleading posts further down in people's feeds so that they're not seen as often. It doesn't remove them. The only thing Meta removes are posts that actually breach its own guidelines, you know, like false advertising or obscenity or whatever it might be. Because Meta is very much involved in free speech and allowing conversations to continue, it only downgrades false information. So we feel that by working with Meta, despite Meta being a major platform for the spread of misinformation, it is better for us to work with them so that some of this misinformation is downgraded rather than to not have a relationship with them at all. And that's essentially how we work. And we are not the only people doing this. There are about 80 accredited, more than 80 actually, accredited fact-checking organizations around the world that work with Meta on this particular type of project.
That's really, it's fascinating. Thank you for going into that. What have you learned about people, and what have you learned about misinformation from following that process? Like, you must see so much information coming from so many different areas. What have you learned while you're working on this project?
I've learned that what I've learned is when you have a mixture, you know, as I was saying, of accurate information and false information, it's really hard to believe what is right. I mean, you may say to yourself, if I see a story that says 94-year-old woman has triplets, that your brain will say that that's just not possible, okay? But there will be people who think, yeah, but maybe they did something with IVF, and maybe it is possible. There's always that sort of, you can never be sure, and the only real way of being sure is making sure that the source of the information, where it's coming from, is a reliable place. And I think it's really hard at the moment with so many sources of information for people to know what is reliable and what isn't reliable. I mean, some people may not agree with this, but the truth is that everybody is sort of a publisher now, okay? And while there's always been criticism of journalists not being trusted, of blah, 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 the reality is that those traditional mainstream media organizations, when we're just talking about the media, they are still probably the most reliable places to go because they have standards, they have trained journalists, they have ethics codes, and they have people who are trained to double check, and they themselves go to as primary sources of information for their journalism. So it can be really hard when you've just got, any old Tom, Dick or Harry sitting in their bedroom and just punching out any old piece of information because it suits their worldview. It's hard.
Thank you. Yeah, it's totally hard, and sometimes the world is crazy. So you can see how I learn things every day that I can't believe that do turn out to be true. You were talking about, everybody having the ability to be a publisher. And Fran, one of your areas of expertise is those online worlds and social audiences and how people talk about different things when they are publishing online. What do you think about the role that technology has in combating misinformation or minimizing or putting alternate views out there?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to look at the reasons why we're more vulnerable to misinformation. And the step change in the way humans communicate with each other is that the moment you take this online, you lose context. And context traditionally is what gives people a pretty sensible understanding of like who's talking and where is that point of view coming from and how they should be interpreting what people are saying because they've got the context. Now, if you're doing this on a face-to-face basis, you have a lot of context because you have like indicators about how people kind of like move, all the non-verbal indicators, all the things that you know about that person, about their social circles, where they kind of like come from. And that helps you put anything that they're saying in context and therefore interpret what they're saying with a high level of sophistication that humans are really great at. The moment you take all of that online, you lose 90% of that context. And as a species also, you need to kind of like from an anthropological standpoint, you just need to look at how quickly humans have been catapulted into this online world. And it's been something that has happened over the space of like 30 years. And it's kind of like the quickest and the biggest step change in the way humans interact with each other that has ever happened to the species. So we're still learning to understand, for example, what context looks like in this world and what signals we can use to understand where an opinion is coming from and how we should be interpreting it. So effectively, we've kind of like put like billions of people in a space where they don't have the tools to really make sense of what's coming to them. Add malicious activity to that mix, and you have a really kind of like dangerous kind of like chaos that can be really complex to undo. And I think on top of that, there's also some kind of like systemic changes that that kind of like contribute to the chaos. And, you've had for the last 70 years an increased distrust in any institution, and this is true for governments, it's true for like churches and religion, is true for obviously the press and the media. And so when you have the level of distrust across the board in anything that is an institution, obviously all bets are off in many fronts. And that's actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing, but it kind of like adds to the lack of points of reference and context that people are trying to bring to their analysis. Then you have kind of like trends that have happened in the media specifically. For example, the blurring of like news and opinion. This is something that traditionally wasn't the case. You had a specific genre of kind of like content that was news content that tended to be quite separated from opinion. But increasingly over the last 20 years, we've seen that kind of like line blurring and kind of like news becoming more similar to entertainment content and opinion being completely kind of like woven into the fabric of the news. And then you have other kind of like things that happen. For example, the rate at which we produce and consume content is insane. So the speed at which we have to process anything that is coming at us doesn't really give us the attention that an op-ed on the New York Times would have kind of like commanded like 20 years ago. Plus, I mean, sorry, there's a lot of stuff, but like, for example, selective consumption of content, that's another one. People make their own media diets, and therefore they create their own landscapes of what content and what points of views they're consuming. Then you have, the content is evolving in that way. For example, makes the consumption of the content a lot more visual than it was textual before. And therefore, again, you're adding other layers of complexity. Like most of fake news and misinfo is not actually fake in the content in itself, but is faking the juxtaposition of an image and a title, and that makes the content malicious. But if you take the title and the image separately, they might be kind of like, well, realistic and totally accurate. It's just that when you put them together, you end up conveying something else. And that is really difficult to stop, because unless you bring in a human that can look at the contents, that can look at the juxtaposition, it makes it really hard for anybody to decipher that. And that's why, if we kind of like go back to your question, sorry for the long preamble, but the issue is, how do we bring context into the mix? And bringing context into the mix means being able to kind of like artificially inject that content into what we're analyzing. And I think fact checkers do a lot of that. But that's, for example, a solution that we partner with at Pulsar called NewsGuard, that helps us kind of like rate the outlets that are producing news content. And they kind of like rate outlets based on the credibility of the outlet. They basically work with a team of journalists and editors that are reviewing and rating information on news websites based on a bunch of journalistic criteria that will look at things like, does the website generally maintain basic standards of accuracy and accountability? Do they repeatedly publish false content? Do they gather and present information responsibly? Do they correct and clarify errors that they've made in the past? So there's like 9 criteria like that contribute to a score that effectively tells us whether a news outlet, an online website that is publishing news content rather than a news outlet, is credible if it's marked as green, whether it's rated red, which means that it fails to meet the basic standards, whether it's satire, or whether it's a platform. So kind of like a website that is hosting views that are not moderated or curated by someone with a journalistic kind of like set of principles and criteria. And what we do with that is that we effectively analyze the billions of interactions that we can see online in the public domain, and then identify when those interactions are coalescing around content that is coming from websites that are not credible. And that kind of like doesn't necessarily tell us that something is fake news, but it tells us there's a high risk that content coming from those websites, from those kind of teams that do not abide to those criteria, might well kind of like pose a risk of misinformation. And I know you're showing this brand misinformation index. This is something that we're playing with. We'll release in a few weeks, 3 weeks more or less, where we're effectively we just want to show how big the problem is. So we take the kind of like top brands on the Interbrand list globally, and we look at how much of the coverage of these brands on a daily and weekly basis is actually coming from websites that are at risk of producing misinformation. And this is more like for us to show how dynamically this changes, because these are kind of like waves of misinformation that move really quickly. And it's for us to show how big the issue is, and kind of like show that every kind of organization is affected by this. And we're doing this with government departments as well, because that's another area where the battle is quite rife. So in this case, we've been looking at the kind of like some of the UK governments that are most affected by misinformation. And again, we're using the same criteria, looking at the overall global news coverage that mentioned those departments, and then breaking down the percentage of that coverage that comes from outlets that are not credible.
I wanted to talk a little bit about governments today as well, because here in Australia, we're a handful of days away from polling day here. And Sushi, you would be seeing a lot of misinformation in that space. What are we seeing in the lead up to the federal election in Australia? What are the narratives you've picked up on?
Right, well, we're seeing quite a lot. Mostly the narratives that we're seeing that are being spread by the minor parties or the fringe element are mostly about voter fraud and electoral integrity. So they appear to be borrowing from the stolen election conspiracies that we saw in the US when Donald Trump lost. I'd say there's more of it now than there were in the 2019 election. Of the small parties, we're really talking about One Nation, Reignite Democracy Australia, the Informed Medical Opinions Party, the United Australia Party, and other fringe elements and advocacy groups who are linked to the lockdown movement. Now, what are they saying? They're the people who are doing it. What are they saying? It would appear that they're mostly seeding voter fraud and election integrity narratives. So misinformation or even disinformation, like people can vote more than once at a polling booth and no one will check that. Or that Australia is using the Dominion voting system, which we are not. Or that if you vote using a pencil on the ballot, that can be tampered with. Or that postal votes are being submitted and processed for dead people. Unvaccinated people won't be allowed to vote. Now, there's no evidence for any of these narratives, but we're also seeing them using Facebook and other social media platforms to recruit scrutineers to turn up at polling booths. They're basically showing you how you should vote. So you put the big parties last. They're accusing the major parties of tricking people, using fraudulent means to get your vote, when in fact they're harvesting your details. Now, we really have to ask the question, why is this happening? The impact of all of this is to create a sense of chaos, uncertainty, fear, undermine trust in authority, and make you think that the system doesn't work properly. And ultimately, that's what undermines the integrity of the electoral system. Because you can see where this is leading. When we get the result on Saturday, if it's not what some people want, you can be sure that they will be asking, was the system rigged? Were people hoodwinked? And more importantly, was the election stolen? Now, these kinds of, you can see the narrative leading in this direction. With regard to the major parties, the kind of misinformation that we're seeing is really they're sticking to the traditional scare campaigns. So Labor pushing the line about a cashless welfare card being extended to pensioners, the coalition sticking to its, Labor is going to introduce death taxes line. But what I really should add here is we are seeing something else, which I think is fairly new, which is the big advocacy groups. So here I'm talking about the conservative advocacy group, Advance Australia, and the other one on the left, which is Get Up. Now, the Advance Australia group has been pushing this whole independents are fake, the fake independence line. Fake in the sense that they're apparently pushing a left-green agenda because they're being funded by Climate 200. So you may have seen in the news, there's been posters where it's the legitimate poster of the independent candidate, but then you see them where they're opening their shirt and underneath they've got the Greens logo on there. Now, the Electoral Commission has found that Advance Australia breached the Commonwealth Electoral Act, which basically says you can't publish anything during an election campaign that is likely to mislead or deceive an elector in relation to the way they cast their vote. And basically, they've been found to have breached that. So they've got about 48 hours, I think it was, since yesterday or the day before, to take all of those kinds of posters down. And the other narrative I think that we probably have all seen is, and again pushed by Advance Australia, is the Reds under the beds narrative, which is the red bus and the mobile billboards that we've all seen showing Chinese President Xi Jinping voting in a ballot box for Labor. Here, obviously, you can see what's happening. They are weaponizing the rhetoric that China is, promoting Labor, and they're doing this for their own political gain. And again, there is no evidence. There is no evidence that China has a preference for Labor or that it's working to install Labor as the next federal government. So I would say, in summary, that's roughly what we're seeing out there in the land of in cuckoo land.
I think that's so useful for our audience today to be aware of. Kate, you're not going into an election this weekend, but that's something that will be heading up in New Zealand next year, I think. When we were talking the other day, you were telling me a little bit about how a shift in the election cycle in Aotearoa, New Zealand, has actually really shifted misinformation. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about that and the election as a catalyst for misinformation?
Absolutely, and that was so interesting, Sushi. Thank you. I've got all sorts of things to think about and go and do some looking at. So our election cycle is a 3-year cycle. So we had an election scheduled for September 2020. And because of lockdown measures, particularly in Auckland, which is obviously our largest city where I am, the election was shifted by 6 weeks, which meant that it coincided more closely with the US electoral cycle. And so at that time, prior to that shift of the election cycle, most of the misinformation and disinformation we had been studying in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which was specifically related to COVID-19 in the original part of our study, but broadened because everyone who was talking about COVID-19 was also talking about a lot of other issues related to things that Fran's brought up around anti-establishment and destabilising democracy. That information had, prior to that shift, been reinterpreted for a New Zealand audience. So it would come from the US, it would come from the UK, it would come from Australia, but we in New Zealand preferred our misinformation repackaged into good old Kiwi vernacular, and you know, we wanted it to feel homegrown, which was quite a charming feature, to be honest, looking at it in retrospect and in reflection, because once we got that temporal coincidence with the US election cycle, that kind of opened the floodgates for US-based material, including obviously QAnon, MAGA, etc., related material to just come through almost completely unchanged. So a really good example that I can give of this, which is sort of interesting and I hope will appeal to the Australian audience too, is that one of our fringe election parties at the time was headed up by a guy called Billy Tekahika. So he was running a set of anti-lockdown fringe ideas. And he predicted in that time coming up to the election that when the government was elected, they were going to institute martial law, which, by the way, on social media, everyone spells martial law the wrong way, which always really irritates me. I can see Sushi's laughing too. It's like, it's not martial like M-A-R-S-H-A-L-L, guys. It's martial. Small things. And at that time, before the shift to the US-based disinformation having all of this sort of weight in Aotearoa, everyone just kind of looked at this report and kind of laughed, because in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we don't have a huge defence force, and our defence force is a peacekeeping force. It's a disaster relief force. It's, you know, something that people in New Zealand are really familiar with as a place of help. You know, like when there's a flood, when there's an earthquake, etc. Who's there? But it's the NZDF. And in fact, we had the New Zealand Defence Force, you know, managing MIQ, for example, for us. And so people just kind of went, that's not going to happen, you know, because that's not going to happen. And it was a real example of how this kind of US-based narrative didn't fly. But then 3 to 4 weeks later, once we'd had this really close shift and there was this, I guess, tidal wave of US disinformation, people started being way more susceptible to it. And we've seen similar changes since then. I just wanted to also, you know, support what Sushi's talking about. So while we don't have an election coming up in New Zealand until next year, we do have a by-election in a seat where a former leader of the opposition has resigned. We've got almost into an Australian model of going through our leaders of the opposition, or our leaders of political parties here in New Zealand. And that by-election is taking place in 4 weeks' time, and some fringe parties that have come to the fore during the period of this intense infodemic are standing in Tauranga, in the district that the by-election is taking place. And we're starting to see very, very similar features to the ones that Sushi's describing being preceded now for the by-election. We have local body elections coming up later in 2022. Again, we've got indications of those fringe political parties or independents who are related to fringe political parties prepared to stand in local body elections, and all of that has strong indications that what you're seeing here in Australia now, Sushi, is what we'll see in Aotearoa, New Zealand next year. And so, you know, that's actually going to be my key research focus for the next 18 months is looking at issues around electoral integrity. And also, I'm interested to hear if you have any of these issues, but we're quite concerned about candidate safety and candidate diversity. So there's been quite significant chilling effects here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, particularly for women and diverse candidates. And I know that that's something that we all know has happened internationally. And we're quite concerned that we're going to see that roll out more in both the local body and the national elections in the next 18 months, where there will be personal targeting, brigading, swarming, protesting, particularly of candidates who represent diverse communities.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I wanted to make sure that we touch on today, because we've been talking about these really large scale narratives, or what we're seeing across Aotearoa or Australia as a whole, or broad technology systems. In our audience today, we have a lot of people who are working in PR and comms, or who might be spending a lot of time working with journalists and thinking about how to communicate with their audience. Kate, I'll ask your thoughts on this first, and then I'll ask you, Fran and Sushi. What can somebody who is working in that role as a PR and comms person, what can they do? How do they combat misinformation? Is it about fighting every conspiracy theory with a truth? What's your advice first, Kate?
So that's a really interesting question. I mean, we know that debunking, you know, specific instances of false information is very, very tricky, and that fact checking in the model that Sushi's described is a really useful way of doing it, but it's inserting, as the Meta project is doing, that interstitial that gets the fact in front of the person before they actually look at the misinformation. What we have been looking at here within the Disinformation project and in Aotearoa is thinking at a whole of society level, which seems to be the way that we need to think. So I really encourage, you know, PR and comms people in journalism to think about framing. One of the key instances that we've had that I always use as an example, apologies, is that at the beginning of 2021, we had a tourist, you know, it was local tourism. Somebody moved from Auckland and went up to the far north, Whangarei, which is a really high Māori, high rural, high need population, and tested positive for COVID-19. And this is at a stage when New Zealand had no cases of COVID-19. This is when we were still in our complete elimination phase. And so there were all these news reports. It was the middle of summer. There were all these news reports of people lining up for hours in their cars or standing to go and get tested in Whangarei, in this large rural service town. And, you know, that it was hot, and why were there not enough tests, and why was it taking so long for everyone to get tested? And I sort of reached out to some journalists and I said, you know, that is one way to ask the question, and it is really important that you hold the government to account about the number of tests that are available, how many staff are there, you know, whether we have the equipment in the country. Those are really important questions to ask. But another frame for exactly the same story and exactly the same picture could be, look at the people of Whangarei who are waiting in the hot sun on a really hot summer's day to get tested with their families because they don't want this disease to spread in their community, because they want to protect each other. You know, those are both the same story, but it's about the frame. And I have really encouraged everyone that I talk to about, you know, the misinformation issues to think about what it means for framing things in ways that remind us of who we are when we're our best selves, because we've had at least 2 years of really not feeling like our best selves, working from home, disconnected, all of those things. And there is a responsibility for people who are expert communicators to tell the truth, but also tell it in ways that help people make good decisions. You know, and people make good decisions when they feel part of something, when they feel included, when they feel like their voice has meaning and impact. And at the moment, the disinformation merchants are creating a space that makes people feel like their voice has meaning and impact. So how can we, you know, the people who value truth, who value democracy, who don't want this disruption that Sushi has so eloquently described, which is their end point and game plan, how can we frame stories in ways that help people feel included and want to be part of that community that we're describing?
Thank you. That's a wonderful way of looking at it. Fran, I'm going to ask you for your thoughts in a second, but I'm just going to do a call out to our audience today. If you have any questions, we'll get to a couple of those in a second, and you can ask your questions just by looking for either the speech bubble to enter a question in the chat or the question mark icon. So if you have a question for Sushi, Kate, or Fran, pop that in there. Fran, what do you think? What can those professional expert communicators that we were talking about before, what can they do in terms of reaching these audiences?
I guess for me the battleground is strategy. So people get bombarded with like a million different narratives about all sorts of topics and events that are happening. If you just look at, for example, the COVID situation, during the kind of like key 18 months of lockdown and pandemic, there were at least, we were tracking, so we were working with the WHO and with other organizations that were interested in understanding, for example, vaccine hesitancy or understanding the spread of kind of like narratives around COVID. And we identified at least like 21 different big narratives that were kind of like theories around COVID, we're explaining COVID and kind of like pushing people in terms of like scenarios and like where COVID was gonna develop into. And if you just look at those were the biggest ones. There's like so many different kind of like stories and directions that the audience is taking. This is just the top of the iceberg. And there's a big job to be done in terms of predicting what narratives are likely to spin out of control, what to prioritize, what to focus on. And there's a big content strategy job to be done in terms of steering kind of like the effort in the direction that is most likely to cause the biggest damage. Because if you try and attack all the different fronts that get open constantly every day on the web, it's really impossible to make an impact. The first job is strategy and prioritization, which if you are a brand or if you are public organizations, what battles are you going to fight, and how do you pick those battles? You can do that with predictive methods to understanding what kind of like narratives are spreading to what kind of audiences, and that will help you prioritize, for example, like this, how they spread and what you tackle. There's also a job to be done in terms of like negatively not paying attention to those narratives, because what you don't want to do is validating actors that are relatively peripheral to the public discourse. And by addressing every single one of them or every single one of these narratives, you actually risk validating them and putting them on a bigger stage than they deserve to be on. So again, it's a strategic job in terms of like prioritization and deciding consciously what are you ignoring, because you will die anyway by itself, and what you actually need to kind of like pay attention to. And the last point is that what I've seen working really well is anticipation rather than confrontation. In other words, it's kind of like it's more effective to try and kind of like put out a point of view that, in parallel to what you've seen being the kind of like misinformation narrative spreading, makes the point that is kind of like realistic and truthful, but doesn't necessarily directly confront the kind of like community or the audience that is spreading the misinformation narrative, and potentially even tries and anticipate the kind of like impact on certain audiences of their narrative to try and reach them before they're actually exposed to that misinformation narrative. Because what we've seen is that if you kind of like contact an audience that has been exposed to a misinformation narrative with a counter narrative, they're very unlikely to change their mind if they're kind of like emotionally bought into that narrative for whatever reason, identification or like belonging to a certain community. It's difficult to convince them in rational ways, but if you anticipate them and you kind of like touch their audience with a kind of like truthful narrative before they actually get exposed to the misinformation one, then you manage to immunize a lot of them. And so that kind of approach tends to be, I mean, in the ideal world, obviously, it's the most productive one, but in some cases you have no chance than just having to confront that misinformation narrative in the first place.
Thank you, Fran. Sushi, what would you add? I've got my eye on the time, so we will wrap up shortly, and we do have a couple of questions. But, you know, you do a lot of work as a journalist and with journalists through RMIT and with Judith Neilson Institute. How do you recommend our communicators who work so closely with those journalists respond? What can they do when they're thinking about their organisation and the way that information flows?
Well, firstly, the point to make right at the outset is that misinformation and disinformation is everybody's problem. It is not just a problem that journalists can put right or fact checkers can put right. It is everybody's problem, and everybody is part of the solution. I think we all really need to be aware that we do need to rebuild trust, firstly, and I'm talking about trust in governments, trust in the media, trust in scientists as well. One way we can do that is that we all need to improve our media literacy, if I can put it like that. I hate that term because it can mean all sorts of things, but I suppose news literacy is what I'm really talking about. Everybody needs to be aware of themselves and what they're doing. So, you know, just in quick summary, I always say to people, stop and think before you share anything. That share button is a trigger, okay? It's a trigger that can send out all sorts of problems all over the place. Ask yourself always, who is saying this? Why might they be saying it? And whatever you're looking at, are you having a really strong reaction to it? Are you getting angry? Are you getting disgusted? Are you feeling pity? All of those kinds of things. This is all really important, and don't just read a headline and go and share it. You'll be surprised how many people actually do that. But I think, and the other point I'd like to make is that if you are in comms or PR or whatever, and you actually know someone who's gone down the rabbit hole, how do you deal with that? This is a difficult issue to deal with. But the first thing I would say is don't cut them off. Don't say, oh my God, I can't talk to that person anymore. That's it, over. You have to keep that line of communication open with them, and you have to keep on talking to them. And as Fran was saying, you know, there's a certain amount of anticipating that you have to do, because when you get in there quickly before they've said sometimes what they're going to say, it can make a lot of difference. So these are not easy problems. These are problems faced by the globe at the beginning of the 21st century, and we are still trying to work out how we deal with them, and nobody has quite got the answers yet, but it's a work in progress.
Sushi, I've got a question from you from Katie. You might have the answers to this one. She's wondering how images and memes are moderated for misinformation. So in the lead up to the election, she is seeing a lot of memes, particularly on Instagram. She's wondering how that kind of image is picked up for misinfo.
How is it picked up? Well, we use a bunch of tools. You know, so for example, Meta gives us what it thinks is misinformation because their algorithms find it. I wish I knew how their algorithms work, then we could use them ourselves, but they're not telling us that right now. But we also use tools like CrowdTangle to find misinformation. There's NewsWhip as well, but I think you have to pay for that as you do with CrowdTangle. First Draft is an organisation. It's a global organisation. Their Australian headquarters are in Sydney. They have a website that you can explore and look at, and they tell you, you know, they pull together a lot of misinformation as well. There's always Google Trends if you want to look up which words are sort of being searched for, and then look at Facebook and do your own searches if you're looking for that kind of stuff. The Australian Electoral Commission put together a disinformation register, and so there's a lot of stuff there. But in terms of how do you actually find them, you know what, for us, it just gets down to human beings. sitting behind a computer and just searching. That's how we do it, you know. It takes a lot of hours and resources. It's tedious, and you feel your brain disintegrating at the end of the day. But really, sometimes that is the only way to find that kind of stuff, if indeed you're looking for it.
We've had a couple of people in the comments recommend things like Snopes as well. What were you going to say, Kate? Sorry.
I was just going to say absolutely, completely, Sushi. That's exactly what we have to end up doing as well. And, you know, particularly because obviously with an election in Australia or what's happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand, you know, Meta's algorithmic tools, just as Twitter's algorithmic tools, are not necessarily going to know what a democracy sausage is. I mean, I know that Twitter does know what a democracy sausage is, but you know, we have localized, situated memes, ideas, frameworks, and so it's so important to have that human element in the searching, and that's what we really focus on doing. You know, there's jokes that or memes that just wouldn't be understood anywhere else, except I sometimes think maybe Australia is the only other place that would understand some of the stuff that we see. Yeah.
Can I just, Ali, can I just quickly add, if there is anybody out there in the audience who has seen memes or things that you think is misinformation, send them to us. We desperately want people to send them to us so we can have a look at them and see what's out there. And we are always really happy to hear from people with whatever information or potential misinformation they might have.
And ditto for anyone online who is based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, info at the disinfoproject.org will get it to us so we can analyse stuff. So yeah, please.
Fran, what were you going to add there?
Yeah, just quickly, Sushi mentioned First Draft, and I'm part of another organization, an academic one, that is called the Visual Social Media Lab. And we actually worked with First Draft to, a few years ago now, to put together like the 20 questions that you should be asking any image that circulates in social media before you actually make a decision about what you're looking at. And it's something that we use to workshop with journalists in terms of like validating content online. And it's something that it's available, so we'll probably share it after this webinar, because it's a really useful kind of like tool for understanding what are the kind of like, what's the checklist that you need to go through before you decide to trust an image on social media and do something about it, like write about it, for example.
Awesome. We'll definitely pull together a little bit of a list of some of the resources that have been shared today. I've got my eye on the time, but I'm going to cheekily throw in one more question and then we'll wrap this session up. Kate, I'm going to throw this one to you. So this is a question from Melanie. Do you think there is a trend with people wanting to move towards hearing and consuming more positive content rather than getting sucked into negative content? And how's that? What's the relationship between that and misinformation?
Well, I think, you know, Sushi talked about it right at the beginning about how people are overwhelmed with the amount of information that they're having to process. And we definitely have seen a pattern in Aotearoa where people are disengaging because of negativity. So one of the features that we've seen take place across the period of the pandemic is the use of downvoting and swarming of angry faces on any live streams or live feeds of, say, the Prime Minister or the Minister of Health or the Director General of Health talking about COVID-19. And we noticed that started influencing audience numbers overall on those particular live streams. So we worked with a couple of different media organisations here just to say, would you mind experimenting, like one day just turning off the ability for people to do the little angry face on the live stream for a couple of days to just see if that made any impact on people's desire to engage with observing, you know, the direct information from government. And it definitely seemed to have an impact. And so that's not like, I'm not a Pollyanna saying let's just all be positive and smiley. It's about the atmosphere and the milieu that it creates for other consumers. So one of the other things that we experimentally did was a colleague of mine, Dr. Susie Wiles, who's a microbiologist with bright pink hair, who's done a lot of work with the World Health Organization over the period of the pandemic, has had a lot of terrible misogynistic abuse and trolling just throughout the entire period of time. But last year, she was made New Zealander of the Year for her work communicating around COVID-19. And we observed really quickly on, so again, on newspaper and other media, social media platforms, so the newspaper's Facebook feed or whatever, that when there would be a story about Susie after she was made New Zealander of the Year, it seemed to give bystanders something that they could contribute into a conversation to mitigate against nastiness. So people would say their usual horrible things about her, and somebody would pop on and say, hey, look, I don't agree with everything she says either, but she is New Zealander of the Year, and they'd link to a news story about her being New Zealander of the Year. And so it's made us really want to continue to experimentally look at how equipping people with tools to use in those discourse spaces that are, counter speech, helps to change people's experience of the online space. Because we actually want people to not turn off and continue to engage. They need to find out what prime ministers are saying. They need to be reading the news. But if that experience is so unpleasant, they're going to turn off, then that's a real detriment, again, in a different way to democracy. So it's not necessarily about being positive, but it's about thinking about how stories and tools, fact-checking, the kind of information that Fran just showed us from Pulsar, that's the kind of thing that somebody could post into a negative thread and it would actually divert a conversation to talking about something else or talking about the issue of misinformation. Yeah, that's what we kind of say.
Awesome. Thank you for asking that one. And if you have asked a question today and I haven't gotten to it, I'm sorry. There are a few there, but we do need to wrap up because I've got my eye on the clock. I've got some very busy panelists who have misinformation and disinformation to fight after this session. So we'll look at those questions that have come through, and if there's a panelist we can link you up to after this session, we will. It's definitely the first webinar I've run where the panelists have asked for memes to be sent to them after the session. So that's a new one for me. Thank you everybody for joining us today. It's been a really excellent conversation. Thank you Sushi, thank you Kate, thank you Fran. For everybody who's registered for this session, you've automatically been signed up as part of the webinar series for our Australian federal election wrap on Tuesday as well, where we'll be talking to Bernard Keane from Crikey and Christine Hurd from Hurd Communications. We don't know what we're necessarily going to talk about yet because the election hasn't actually happened, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot to unwrap. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists and really enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
See you later.